After our M16 rifle practice, we headed back to the 116th AHC area. Talk about hot. I couldn't walk across the unshaded flight line for 100 yards without feeling woozy dizzy and ready to pass out. It took me a full month to sort of get used to the intense heat. Our training and job now consisted of working on helicopters about 16 hours a day and getting rocketed at night. We started to work on the helicopters in the sunlight on the flight line, but couldn't even think straight out in the sun. After a while, 2 walls were thrown up made of artillery wooden crates filled with dirt, and then a tarp thrown over the 2 sides to form a sort of small hangar. By keeping wet in the shade, we could work much better. We had to relearn working on the Hueys as we forgot some of the finer details about the aircraft. No one had a torque wrench, which we were supposed to use to tighten all nuts and bolts. We had to guess at the torque using a standard wrench. Someone got a torque wrench from somewhere, and we checked out our accuracy. We were pretty darn close. New helicopters were coming in, and we were kept very busy. We would go out to the flight line when the 116th flight came in about sunset. The flight consisted of 10 D model Hueys and 2 Huey model A, B, or C gunships that carried rockets and pilot-fired machine guns mounted at the lower sides, along with M60S fired from the open doors, 1 on each side. The D models each had 1 M60 machine gun mounted on each side that the crew chief and gunner fired from the open doors. The D models each carried 6 infantry with Pax rifles and ammo from one place to another. The D models had to land on the ground at landing zones and pickup zones, usually under enemy fire. A very dangerous assignment, as it was the time when the helicopters were still and subject to automatic weapons fire, mortar fire and rocket-propelled grenade fire and satchel charge attempts, and sometimes even mines. The gunships never landed but would stay in the air protecting somewhat the flight, as we called the 10 Hueys. The flight had assignments at all daylight hours and at some nights also. The flight usually flew about 17 hours a day. When the flight came in, the guys were tired, if some not killed or wounded. I looked at these guys as the bravest guys I had ever seen. Any one of them could have quit flying combat at any time, no questions asked, as they were all volunteers. Well, here's one guy that will never volunteer to fly combat. I am no way that brave. That's nuts. I suppose it's war, but why is it the same guys fighting all the battles? Essentially, the combat helicopter crews and the infantry were fighting the bullet-to-bullet war. Artillery guys in fire support bases were in the fighting war, as were some combat engineers. The other 8 out of 10 soldiers in Vietnam were safe in the base as support troops. Safe in the base was okay with me.
As we worked all day on the helicopters, our rest was interrupted at night by the constant rocket attack. The rockets would come in about 20 or 30 at a time and then stop, and then start again later. They seemed to drop on our aviation hooch area and the helicopter flight line. All combat helicopter flight crews were in their hooches at night, and the helicopters were parked on the ground on the flight line. The enemy, of course, knew this. We were vulnerable in a static position at night, so they blasted away at us. Without helicopters and their crews, the infantry would go nowhere. Any road trip by the infantry or hike outside the base camp would fairly soon be ambushed with overwhelming forces, with no immediate help from our airmobile units if the helicopters and their crews were disabled. Helicopters and their highly trained crews were essential to the war effort. Knock out the assault helicopters and their crews, and the war would come to a grinding halt. I often felt that a part of this war effort was an experiment in airmobile operations. The French in Vietnam were defeated by not being mobile enough. Canals and a few primitive roads were the transportation network of the country. No one went far from their home. It was much like the old Western 1800s days in the cavalry, when the army set up forts in the Indian country. When a cavalry patrol went out from the 1800s fort, it was just a matter of time before the patrol would be ambushed by superior enemy forces, and the soldiers killed, with sometimes no survivors. The base camps and fire support bases and the special forces camps in Vietnam were basically surrounded by tens of thousands of enemy soldiers. We had 500,000 soldiers in Vietnam at the time, but only 2 out of 10 were fighting the war. The rest were support troops. So, we had about 100,000 troops who could go into the field to fight about an estimated 400,000 enemy troops on the enemy's own ground and under the enemy's own terms. Plus, most of the South Vietnamese population was on the side of the communists, as they considered the American troops as invaders. The American infantry were always outnumbered in the field, and the field is where the enemy lived.
I
The Americans had their isolated camps here and there. The enemy controlled the rest of the country, just as in the 1800s, sending the cavalry troops out into enemy-held territory, which was everywhere, was sending them to their deaths. It was the same in Vietnam. Without helicopters, it would have been impossible to fight the Vietnam War on the ground. As it was impossible for Americans to win the ground war. Eventually, as a 19-year-old soldier fighting the war directly, I could understand the futility of it all. President Kennedy said that it would be impossible to win the Vietnam War politically, and that in the long run, it would be impossible to win the war militarily. He was a soldier and knew how wars were fought.
Our Cu Chi base camp was constantly under attack. Helicopters, fuel dumps, ammo dumps, troop barracks, everything was being blown up. The base was neither safe nor secure. Enemy troops would infiltrate the base camp at night, using satchel charges to cause destruction. How do I know? I witnessed it under strange circumstances. It was like an initiation ritual. To be accepted by some in the 116th, you had to inhale marijuana smoke. I had never smoked pot or even cigarettes before. But one night, I was invited to join some veterans from California and smoke pot in a rocket crater just outside the barracks area. As we sat in the bomb crater, passing around the pipe, we suddenly came under fire. It was the enemy, running by on one of their satchel charge missions. We hadn't brought our rifles with us. The moonlight illuminated the scene, and as bullets kicked up dirt next to my head, everything seemed to slow down. I only took one hit. It was a surreal experience. The base was vulnerable at night. We did have our own patrols called the Interior Guard, who were supposed to fight off the enemy inside the camp. But after the enemy stopped shooting and ran off, the lead veteran suggested we go to the club, have a beer, and listen to some music. We climbed out of the crater, and as we walked towards the company area, I felt like I was floating on a cloud. We reached the Enlisted Men's Club, a rundown hooch with a makeshift bar and warm beer. White Rabbit by the Jefferson Airplane started playing on a tape deck inside. I had never heard such beautiful music, and the lyrics seemed to resonate with me in that moment. It was a pleasant experience. We stayed in the club for a while. That night, I had my baptism in marijuana, and it was intense. I realized that I could never be combat ready while high on marijuana. I became more of an observer than a participant, and I almost got shot in the crater while smoking. The next morning, it was back to the flight line as a mechanic. We were also assigned duty as perimeter guards at night, all night. We would work 16 hours as helicopter mechanics during the day, and then become heavily armed guards for 8 hours at night. The purpose was to prevent the VC and NVA sappers from infiltrating our perimeter and causing destruction. Cu Chi Base Camp was massive, about 2 miles by 2 miles, with a perimeter that was not properly defended. There were too few infantry to man the perimeter and patrol outside the wire. So the Army decided to use mechanics, cooks, and anyone else to guard the perimeter at night. In other words, soldiers were expected to stay awake and alert 24 hours a day. It was impossible. Mechanics would sometimes make mistakes in their work, which could lead to helicopter crashes and the loss of many lives. Or at night, you would find almost everyone sleeping on perimeter guard duty, which was the norm. It was simply impossible to stay awake for 24 hours straight. This led to my next adventure at Kuchi.